Somewhere in rural Missouri, the sky goes on forever. Flat land, dead grass, a gravel road that narrows until it disappears into nothing. And at the end of that road, a shed, rusted bronze from decades of weather, corrugated steel roof, one small window dark, a padlock on the door that has no business still being locked. A boy stands in front of it. 16 years old, jacket too big, hands that haven't built anything yet, a golden retriever sitting beside him perfectly still, nose pressed to the gap at the bottom of the door, reading something no human in that moment can read. The boy looks at the key in his hand, small, brass, worn smooth from someone else's years. He looks at the dog. The dog doesn't move. Somewhere behind them, everything they owned fits in the back of a borrowed truck. He puts the key in the lock, turns it, and the door swings open. Part 1. The boy with no good options. He was 16 years old. He had a dog, a black notebook, and $43 in a jar under his bed. That was it. That was the whole list. Most people who looked at Eli Voss saw exactly what he had. The worn-out sneakers, the second-hand jacket 2 sizes too big across the shoulders, the quiet that sat around him like a weather system nobody else could feel. They saw a kid with not much. They were wrong about that. But that part comes later. Clover Falls, Missouri was the kind of town that looked exactly like what it was, flat, honest, slightly tired around the edges. Main Street had a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and a barber shop that had been owned by the same family for 3 generations. The grain elevator at the north end of town was the tallest structure for 12 miles in any direction. The water tower had been repainted twice in living memory, and both times someone had written something on it before the paint dried, and both times the town had argued for 3 weeks about whether to paint over it again. It was that kind of town. The kind where everybody knew your business before you did. The kind where a 73-year-old woman who'd paid her rent on time for 15 years was known not just as a tenant, but as Nora, just Nora. The woman who grew tomatoes in coffee cans on her porch and left extra jars of preserves on her neighbor's steps in September without ever saying a word about it. The kind of town where that meant something. And then it didn't. Nora Ashby had lived on Decatur Lane for 15 years. The house was white with green shutters, which sounds cheerful, and it was mostly 2 bedrooms, a porch that caught the afternoon light, a kitchen with enough room to cook a proper meal, and a window above the sink that looked out on the backyard where she'd planted the same garden every spring since the year she moved in. She paid her rent on the 1st of every month, always had, always in full, always by check, written in her careful looping cursive that looked like it belonged on a letter from another era. The landlord was a man named Walter Briggs. Walter was 80 years old and had the manner of someone who had decided somewhere around age 60 that there was no longer any point in pretending to be more complicated than he was. He was straightforward. He was fair. He'd known Nora's situation since the beginning, the son who died in a work accident, the daughter-in-law who'd left the grandson who'd come to live with her when he was 8 years old and never left, and he'd set the rent accordingly and left it there. He wasn't sentimental about it. He just believed that certain things were right. Walter Briggs died on the 2nd Tuesday of September, quietly, in his sleep, the way people who have lived well sometimes go, as if the whole thing had been arranged in advance. His son Barrett Holt inherited 3 rental properties in Clover Falls, a storage unit full of furniture nobody wanted, and an attitude toward all of it that bore absolutely no resemblance to his father's. Eli was the one who found Cooper 2 years ago on a Thursday afternoon in late October, walking home from school along the stretch of Route 9 that ran between the dollar store and the old cotton gin building that had been converted into something nobody could quite remember anymore. Cooper was in the ditch, not injured, not sick, just sitting there in the muddy water like he'd decided that particular ditch was as good a place as any, and he'd wait and see what happened next. Golden, maybe a year-old coat, matted with mud ribs, slightly visible, one ear up, one ear folded over, watching Eli with the particular patience of an animal that has already decided something. Eli looked at him. Cooper looked back. Oh no, Eli thought. Oh no, absolutely not. He was home 20 minutes later with a mud-covered golden retriever and absolutely no plan. Nora stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the dog and looked at Eli. No, she said. Cooper sat down and tilted his head. Absolutely not, she said. Cooper tilted his head the other way. His paws, Eli said. Look at his paws. Nora looked at the paws. The paws were very muddy and very large, and one of them was resting on the kitchen floor in a way that seemed entirely intentional, like the dog understood that this was a negotiation and he was making his opening position clear. Nora pressed her lips together. He stays outside until he's clean, she said. Cooper slept at the foot of Eli's bed that night, and every night after that. They didn't discuss it further. Eli's father had been a man named David Voss. Eli kept one photograph of him. In it, David was maybe 30 years old, standing on the bed of a pickup truck with one hand shading his eyes against the sun. He was laughing at something out of frame. His other hand was resting on the truck's cab roof, and even in a photograph, even standing still, he looked like a man who was always moving forward. David Voss died when Eli was 8. A structural collapse at a construction site in Jefferson City on a Wednesday morning. Quick, no warning, the kind of thing that rewrites an entire future in about 4 seconds. Eli's mother had not been built for grief the way some people are. She left when Eli was 10. A note on the kitchen table, some money in an envelope, a phone number that was disconnected 3 months later. Nora never said a word against her, not once. Not ever. That was one of the things about Nora. She had her opinions. She had them in detail and in full color, but she kept them to herself when keeping them served the person she loved. What she said instead on the morning Eli came downstairs and found her sitting at the kitchen table with the note in her hand was, "You hungry?" He was. She made eggs. They ate together, and outside the kitchen window, the October light was thin and gold, and neither of them talked about what was on the table between them, and that was how they got through it. That was how they'd gotten through most things. The notebook had been his father's idea. Not literally. David had been gone for 8 years before Eli started keeping one. But it was something his father used to say. Eli remembered it the way you remember things that were said casually without knowing they'd stick. Write it down, son. Your memory lies. Paper doesn't. Eli had started the first notebook at 12. Black cover. College ruled. He wrote down things, he noticed things he needed to remember. Lists of problems and lists of possible solutions. He wrote down things he read that seemed important. He wrote down the make and model of every car engine he'd taught himself to identify by sound, which was now up to 14. It was not the kind of thing he told people about. By the time he was 16, he was on his 4th notebook. Same kind, same color, same small, straight handwriting that his teacher had once described as looking like it had been measured with a ruler. He wrote down what he observed, what he calculated, what he didn't yet know but intended to find out. He was very good at noticing things other people missed. Cooper was good at this too, in his own way. They made a reasonable team. Eli saw the eviction notice before Nora did. It was a Friday morning in early October. He'd gone out at 6:15 to walk Cooper, the way he did every morning, which was actually less of a walk and more of a negotiated patrol, Cooper determining the route and Eli following along with his hands in his jacket pockets. The notice was taped to the front door, not left in the mailbox. Taped with 3 strips of packing tape, the kind of overkill that says the person doing it wanted to make sure it wasn't going to blow away or be missed. Eli stopped, read it. Read it again. 30 days, effective immediately from date of posting. The language was dense and legal and cold in the way that official cruelty always sounds like someone had worked hard to make the worst possible news feel like a form you'd filled out wrong. At the bottom, Barrett Holt property manager, not even owner, property manager. Eli stood there in the early morning cold with the notice in his hand and Cooper sitting at his feet, and he did the thing his father had taught him without meaning to. He stood still. He let the information actually land. He did not immediately start moving. He thought, she doesn't know yet. He thought she can't see this the way I'm seeing it right now. He thought 30 days is 30 days. Then he thought, okay. He took the notice off the door carefully so the tape didn't tear it, folded it twice, and put it in his jacket pocket. He walked Cooper around the block, let the dog take his time at the 3 spots he always needed to investigate thoroughly, watched the sky turn from dark gray to pale gray to the watery October blue that passed for morning in Missouri. Then he went inside and read the notice to Nora at the kitchen table over coffee. He read it straight through without editorializing because she deserved the actual information. Nora listened with both hands around her mug. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that isn't absence. That's a person doing real work on the inside. Well, she said finally, that was all, just well. And then she got up and refilled her coffee and stood at the sink looking out at the backyard garden. And Eli looked at the garden too, and he thought about the fact that she'd planted those tomatoes in March, and they wouldn't come back, not at this address, not in coffee cans that would go wherever they were going. He wrote 30 days in his notebook. Then he wrote start tomorrow. He started the next morning. Nora wanted to come. He told her the truth, which was that he could cover more ground alone, which was technically accurate, but not the whole reason. The whole reason was that he'd already made 2 calls from his room the night before, one to an apartment complex on Route 9 and one to a woman on the local Facebook group who'd posted a rental listing, and both times the person on the other end had changed tone the moment they understood they were talking to a 16-year-old calling about an apartment for his grandmother. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was something more unconscious than that, like their brain just automatically filed the call under not serious and started looking for the exit. Eli decided he'd rather have that happen to him than to Nora, so Cooper went with him, which helped with the walking, and the notebook went with him, which helped with the thinking, and he spent 7 days working through every possibility Clover Falls and the surrounding towns had to offer. 7 addresses, 7 mornings. The first was a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building off Main Street, 23 steps up from the ground floor. Eli counted. Nora's left knee had been bad for 2 years. He thanked the landlord and left. The second allowed dogs with a $500 non-refundable pet deposit. He did the math in his head walking out the door. The deposit plus first and last month plus the monthly rate would consume almost everything they had. He wrote no in the notebook and underlined it. The third was clean and light and had a ground floor entrance and was perfect in almost every way except it required a 12-month lease with no flexibility, and the lease started November 1st and their 30 days were up on November 4th. 3 days. He asked if there was any flexibility on the start date. The landlord, a pleasant man in his 50s who clearly felt genuinely bad about what he was about to say, said no. The previous tenant was still there. He was sorry. Eli said he understood and meant it. The fourth had a strong smell that the listing had described as recently renovated, and that turned out to mean recently painted over something that had happened here before. The fifth didn't allow dogs. He looked at Cooper. Cooper looked back. Not this one, Cooper's face said. Obviously not, Eli agreed. The sixth and seventh were further out, technically, in the next county, and when Eli added up the cost of gas to get Nora to her doctor and her church and the senior center where she volunteered, every Thursday the numbers stopped working before he even got to the rent itself. He sat in the parking lot of a gas station on the way back from the 7th address and opened his notebook to the page with all 7 addresses listed. He went through them one more time, like there was going to be a different answer this time, like the math would cooperate if he just looked at it again with the right attitude. It didn't cooperate. He drew a single line through all 7 addresses. Cooper put his head on Eli's knee from the passenger seat. "I know," Eli said. He sat there for a while. Then he drove to the county assessor's office because there was a program he'd read about it on the county website at 11:30 the night before for emergency housing assistance for households in crisis. The county assessor's office smelled like old paper and carpet cleaner, and the particular institutional quiet of a building where difficult conversations happen every day, and the furniture had absorbed all of them. The waiting area had 6 chairs and a rack of pamphlets about property tax exemptions and a water cooler that made a sound every few minutes like it was sighing. Eli signed in, waited. Cooper sat beside him and watched the water cooler with sustained professional suspicion. A woman at the front desk eventually called him back and explained the emergency housing assistance program in the kind, careful way of someone who'd had this conversation many times and understood that kindness was necessary but couldn't change the underlying facts. The program existed. It was real. It helped people. The wait list was 4 to 7 months. Eli wrote that down. He thanked her. He meant it. He gathered his jacket and stood up and clicked his tongue for Cooper and started toward the door. "Hey!" He turned around. The man who'd spoken was sitting at a desk to the left, past the counter, half visible behind a monitor. 50s maybe, gray at the temples, the look of someone who had been doing the same job long enough to recognize most kinds of trouble by their posture. His name placard said G. Pemberton. Gus Pemberton had worked in this office for 22 years. He had seen in that time a very large number of people walk toward his door and realized partway there that what they were carrying wasn't going to get any lighter by leaving. He looked at Eli. He looked at Cooper. He looked at Eli's notebook and the particular way the cover was worn at the corner from being carried everywhere. He said, "There's a parcel out on Rudder Road." He said it the way you say something you've been thinking about for a minute, not impulsively, but not like a formal announcement either, like a fact he'd been holding that might now be useful to someone. Counties had it listed for a while. Old storage structure, quarter acre, hasn't sold. I don't think anyone's even made an inquiry. Eli walked back to the counter. "How much?" Gus looked at his monitor. His expression was carefully neutral in the way of someone choosing honesty over encouragement. $1. County just wants the delinquent taxes off the books. Eli wrote that down. "What's wrong with it?" Gus was quiet for a moment. "It's a shed," he said. "Metal construction. Been sitting empty a long time. I don't have current condition information." A pause. "I wouldn't get your hopes up about it." Eli looked at his notebook, at the 7 crossed-out addresses. "Can I get the address?" Cooper stood up from where he'd been sitting, both ears forward, the posture he got when something required his full attention. Gus noticed. He looked at the dog for a second, then looked at Eli, then wrote the address on a sticky note and passed it across the counter. Eli took it, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket next to the eviction notice that was still there, still folded, still exactly as it had been on the morning he'd read it at 6:15 with the October cold around him and 30 days suddenly feeling like a very short amount of time. "Thank you," Eli said. He meant that too. Nora said no, not dramatically, not with tears or raised voices, just no. A flat, quiet no from across the kitchen table, hands wrapped around her mug, looking at him with the expression she got when she thought he was being optimistic. in a way that was going to hurt him. $1, Eli. Yes, for a shed on a quarter-acre of land. A shed that no one has wanted for... She stopped. How long has it been listed? Gus didn't know exactly. A shed that no one has wanted for an unknown length of time, that the county cannot tell us the condition of. That costs $1. She said dollar like she was testing how it felt in her mouth. $1. Like maybe if she said it correctly, it would start making sense. Eli opened his notebook, turned it so she could read the page with the 7 addresses, slid it across the table. She read it, all of it, slowly. He waited. She got to the end, looked up, looked back down, looked at Cooper, who was sitting in the kitchen doorway, watching the whole thing with the alert, interested attention of an animal that understood more of human conversation than was strictly comfortable to consider. "What does he think?" Nora said. This was not entirely a joke. Eli looked at Cooper. Cooper looked at Eli. Well, Cooper's expression said, "I think we should look at it." "He thinks we should look at it," Eli said. Nora pressed her lips together. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Eli started counting the seconds without meaning to. 14, 15, fine, she said. $1. They signed the papers 2 days later. Eli had driven out to Rudder Road the day before, alone, just to look. He hadn't told Nora because there was no point in both of them making the same discovery at the same time in the same place. If he looked first, he could figure out how to talk about it before she had to see it. Rudder Road ran east from town, past the grain co-op and a stretch of farmland that had been converted to soybeans sometime in the last decade, and then converted back to something that couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. The turnoff was a gravel track, nearly invisible from the road, marked by a county stake that had rusted to the color of dried blood and a no dumping sign that bore evidence of having been ignored. The shed was at the end of the track. Eli parked and walked toward it through dead grass that reached his calves, and he stopped about 20 feet out and just looked. Metal construction, like Gus had said, maybe 22 by 15 feet. The original color was unidentifiable beneath decades of rust and oxidation that had turned the whole exterior a deep streaked bronze. Corrugated steel roof bowed slightly on the west end, but he looked carefully intact. One small window on the south wall covered from the inside with what appeared to be cardboard, a door with a padlock that was somehow still locked. He stood there for a long time. He thought about the 7 crossed out addresses. He thought about the 4 to 7 month wait list. He thought about the eviction notice still folded in his jacket pocket. He thought about his father saying, "Write it down, son. Your memory lies." He wrote in his notebook, "Structure appears sound, roof intact, foundation unknown, window south wall covered, padlocked, no visible collapse or major damage." Then below that, it's a start. Then he drove back to town and called Gus Pemberton and said they'd take it. The morning they left Decatur Lane, Nora did not look at her garden. Eli saw her not look at it. The deliberate avoidance, the way she kept her eyes forward while he loaded the last boxes into the truck he'd borrowed from Jim Radnor 2 streets over, who'd asked no questions when Eli had called and simply said he'd have the truck out front by 7. People in Clover Falls were like that. Not all of them, but enough. The moving took 3 hours. There wasn't much. 15 years in a house, and you'd think there would be more. But Nora had always been someone who kept what was necessary and let the rest go. The kitchen table, dark wood one corner, repaired with a wood patch that had never quite matched. That was the only piece she absolutely wouldn't leave. Everything else was negotiable. Eli wedged the table into the truck with particular care. Cooper supervised. When there was nothing left in the house except light and the shapes of furniture pressed into the carpet, Eli stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen window above the sink, the view of the backyard, the bare November garden. He didn't look long. He pulled the door shut. Rudder Road at 8 in the morning had a particular quality to the light. Low, sideways, the kind of November light that makes everything look like a photograph from a long time ago. Eli drove east with Nora in the passenger seat and Cooper between them with his chin on Nora's knee, and none of them talked. The gravel track came up faster than he expected. He turned in. The shed sat at the end of the track the way it had 2 days before, unchanged, unmoved, a rusted metal structure on a quarter-acre of dead grass under a pale Missouri sky, looking like exactly what it was, something that had been forgotten by everyone who might have cared about it. Eli parked. He got out. The air was cold and carried the smell of cold earth and dry grass and something else, something faint that he couldn't immediately identify. He reached into his jacket pocket and found the county envelope Gus had sent him with the deed paperwork. Inside, along with the folded papers, was a small key, brass-colored, worn smooth where someone had held it many times over many years. The padlock key. He held it for a second. Cooper was already at the shed door, not sniffing around it the way dogs sniff at new things, not circling, just standing directly in front of it, both ears forward, nose at the base of the door, working slowly and with a focus that was different from his normal investigating. Methodical, deliberate, like he was reading something. Eli walked up beside him. "What do you smell?" Cooper didn't look up, just moved his nose along the base of the door, one direction, then back. Nora had gotten out of the truck and was standing behind them, coat buttoned to the throat, watching the dog with an expression Eli couldn't quite read. "What is it?" she said. "I don't know," Eli said. He looked at the key in his hand. He looked at the padlock. He thought, this is probably nothing. This is a shed that nobody wanted, a shed that cost $1 because that's what things are worth when nobody wants them. He thought, this is the only door that's still open. He put the key in the padlock, turned it. The mechanism released with a sound like something that had been held shut for a very long time, finally letting go. The door swung outward on hinges that screamed with rust. The smell that came out to meet them was dense and complicated. Cold earth, old wood, the specific staleness of air that had been sitting undisturbed for years. And underneath all of that, something dry, something papery, almost sweet. Cooper walked straight in without hesitation. Eli looked at Nora. Nora looked at Eli. "Well," she said for the second time in 30 days, and followed the dog into the dark. The interior was dim. Light came from the open door and from a crack where the roof line met the south wall, just enough to see by, just enough to make shapes out of shadows. Eli stood still and let his eyes adjust. Floor wood planking, old, visibly soft in places, covered in grit and decades of dust. Walls bare metal streaked with oxidation. Along the east wall, wooden shelves empty except for 2 rusted coffee cans and a coil of wire so corroded it had fused into a solid shape. In the far corner, a wooden workbench with legs slightly uneven, one end propped up with a piece of tin. It was not much. It was, if he was being precise, almost nothing. A shed. A dim, cold, rust-smelling shed at the end of a gravel track in a county where nobody drove anymore. And yet, Cooper had gone directly to the northwest corner. Not to the shelves, not to the workbench. To the far corner of the floor, where the planking was darkest and the soft spots were worse. He was standing there now, not moving, not making a sound, just standing with his nose to the floor in the way he sometimes did when he'd found something that required patience before proceeding, like whatever he'd found wasn't going anywhere, like he was giving it time to understand that he already knew. Eli walked over and crouched down beside him. The planking in this corner was worse than the rest. Bowed, dark with old moisture. One section had already split partly along the grain. He pressed his hand flat against the wood. solid underneath, not earth, something else. He looked at Cooper. Cooper looked back. That look, yes, it said, right here. Eli put his hand in his jacket pocket and found his multi-tool. He carried it everywhere, had since he was 12, and opened the flat blade and used it to probe along the edge of the worst section of planking. The blade caught something, a seam, a deliberate seam cut clean and straight, forming a rectangle in the floor approximately 4 feet by 3, and at one corner of the rectangle flush with the wood so you'd never see it unless you were looking, a small iron ring recessed into the surface. A pull ring. Eli sat back on his heels. He looked at the ring for a long moment. He thought about all the things it might mean and all the things it probably meant and all the reasons why a reasonable person would be cautious here. Structural integrity, animal habitation, the practical question of what he was actually going to do with whatever was beneath this floor, regardless of what it turned out to be. He thought about all of that for approximately 30 seconds. Then he looked at Cooper, who was still watching him with those calm golden eyes, and he put 2 fingers through the iron ring and he pulled. The trapdoor was heavier than it looked. It came up with resistance swollen from old moisture, the wood fighting the hinges that hadn't moved in, he didn't know how long, years, decades, long enough that the whole mechanism had essentially become one solid thing that didn't want to be disturbed. Then it gave. All at once, the way a door gives when the pressure finally overcomes the resistance, and Eli stumbled backward a step, and the trapdoor swung up and hit the floor beside the opening. The smell that came up from the dark below, not bad, not rot or mold or the cold smell of forgotten earth, something else. That dry, papery sweetness he'd caught the first second the shed door opened, stronger now, concentrated, like the inside of a very old book in a very well-kept library. Below, a space maybe 5 feet deep, walls of packed earth lined with fitted wooden boards. Dark Eli reached for his phone, turned on the flashlight, and saw, from the earthen floor up to just below the trapdoor opening, bundle after bundle after bundle, wrapped in cloth that had aged to the color of old cream, tied with cord, placed with care, stacked with the particular precision of someone who had done this intentionally and had expected to come back for them. 31 bundles. He counted without meaning to, just his mind doing what it did, with new information cataloging, ordering, trying to understand before it had enough information to understand with. Nora had come to stand beside him. She was looking down into the space. She was very still. The flashlight caught the cloth wrappings, and they glowed in the light, cream-colored and patient, and the shed was quiet around them, except for Cooper's slow breathing and the sound of the November wind moving through the dead grass outside. "Eli," Nora said. Her voice was different. "What is that?" he said. She didn't answer right away. She was looking at the shape of the bundles, the way they were wrapped, the cord, the cloth, the careful uniformity of it. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet. "I don't know yet," she said, "but whoever put those there, they meant to come back for them." Eli looked at his grandmother. He looked at the bundles. He looked at Cooper, who was still standing at the edge of the trapdoor, one paw on the rim, looking down with the settled, certain expression of an animal that has done the thing it came here to do. Eli reached into his pocket, found his notebook, found his pen. He wrote trapdoor, west corner, below shed floor, 31 bundles wrapped, unknown contents, dry, intact. He paused, then he wrote one more line. Someone put these here on purpose. He underlined on purpose. Twice. Part 2, what Cooper found. The first bundle took 2 hands to lift, not because it was awkward, because it was dense, the kind of weight that surprises you, the kind that makes you adjust your grip and pay attention. Eli carried it up from the hatch and set it on the workbench. Then the second, then the third. He didn't open them yet. He just moved them one at a time. Careful. The way you handle something when you don't know what it is, but something in your hands is already telling you to be careful anyway. Nora stood beside the workbench and watched him work. Cooper sat near the trapdoor and watched the opening like a guard who had finished his job and was now simply making sure no one undid it. 31 bundles. Eli counted them twice, set them in rows across the workbench and the floor beside it. The shed was small. The bundles filled it in a way that changed the feeling of the space, made it feel occupied, made it feel like something was happening here that hadn't happened in a very long time. Then Eli looked at Nora. Nora looked at the nearest bundle. "You open it," she said. So he did. The muslin wrapping had aged to the color of old cream. The cotton cord had dried and stiffened but held. Eli worked it loose with careful fingers, the way you'd open something you weren't sure you had the right to open. Loop by loop. No pulling, no rushing. The cord came free. He folded back the muslin, layer by layer, and then the quilt was there, large, maybe full bed-sized, a pattern radiating outward from a central octagonal block. Dozens of distinct fabric pieces pieced together in deep indigo, rust, gold, a cream so pale it was almost white. The stitching. Eli leaned in. The stitching was, he didn't have the word for it at first. He just stared. Small, impossibly even. The kind of precision that made you feel something was wrong with your own eyes. Like surely there was a machine involved. Like surely no human hand did this by choice, by lamplight, by patience alone. Nora made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The small, involuntary kind that escapes before you decide to let it. She reached out and put her fingers on the edge of the quilt, very gently, like you touch something in a museum when you think no one is watching. "Eli," she said. Her voice had changed again, different from last night, different from this morning. This was the voice she used when something surprised her, past the point of pretending it hadn't. "Whoever made this," she said, very quietly. They were talking to someone, through the cloth. Eli looked at her. Then he looked at the quilt. He thought about what that meant. Talking through cloth. He turned it over in his mind the way he turned mechanical problems over, looking for the logic, looking for the structure underneath. And then he saw it. Not literally, not a message, but the intention. Every stitch was a decision. Every tiny, perfect stitch was someone sitting still long enough to make one more, and another, and another. This wasn't decoration. This wasn't passing time. This was someone saying, "I was here. I made this. Remember that I was here." He stood up straight. "I need to find out what these are," he said. "Yes," Nora said. "You do." Cooper got up from his spot by the trap door, walked over, sat beside Nora, and looked at the quilt with an expression that could only be described as respectful. Eli picked up his notebook, started writing. He opened 4 more bundles that night, each one different, each one the same in the way that mattered, the precision, the intention, the specific density of care that took up actual physical space in the room, a double ring pattern in colors that had no business being this vivid after this many years underground, a log cabin design so exact in its geometry that Eli kept tilting his head, expecting to find an error, not finding one, a cathedral windows pattern, tiny folded pieces, each one stitched with the kind of focus that made your eyes ache just looking at it. A 4th quilt in a flying geese pattern, the triangles so perfectly consistent in size and angle that Eli measured 3 of them against each other with his thumbnail and found no variation he could detect. Nora sat on the camping cot and held each one in her lap for a while before Eli rewrapped it. She didn't say much, neither did he. There was a lot happening in that shed that didn't need words. The library was 40 minutes away. Eli left at 7 in the morning with Cooper in the passenger seat and his notebook open on the center console, to a clean page. He'd spent part of the night writing down every detail he could document: the colors, the patterns, the texture of the cloth, the smell of the indigo. He'd taken photographs with his phone, 26 of them, from different angles and different distances, trying to capture the stitching in enough detail that someone who knew what they were looking at could see what he was seeing. He pulled into the library parking lot at 7:43. The library didn't open until 9. He sat in the car. Cooper looked at him. "We're early." "I know, very early." "I know that too." He read through his notes, added 3 things he'd remembered in the car, crossed out one word and replaced it with a better one. Then he put the notebook down and watched the parking lot fill up slowly as 9 o'clock approached, and he thought about 31 bundles waiting in a shed on Rudder Road, and a grandmother who had not once in 15 years asked him for anything she thought she could manage without. At 9:02, the library doors opened. Mrs. Lenora Quill was not a woman who had time for vague questions. Eli understood this within 45 seconds of approaching her desk. She was 64, reading glasses on a beaded chain, hair silver and cut short in the no-nonsense way of someone who had made a decision about that years ago and never revisited it. She looked at Eli with the alert, slightly impatient expression of a person who had been answering questions since before he was born and had opinions about the quality of those questions. Cooper sat beside Eli and looked at her with genuine interest. She looked at Cooper. "He can stay," she said, "if he's quiet." "He's quiet," Eli said. "You have a question." "I have photographs." He put his phone on the desk and showed her the first image. She looked at it, looked at him, looked back at the photograph. She took her glasses off the chain and put them on without saying anything and looked at the photograph again, this time for considerably longer. "Where did you get this?" she said. "Under the floor of a shed on Rudder Road." Silence. "A shed?" "Yes, under the floor." "There was a trap door," Eli said. 31 bundles. This is one of them." She took the phone and looked through the other photographs, all 26 of them, slowly. She stopped on the stitching close-ups and stayed there for a while. Then she set the phone down and stood up. "Follow me," she said. 3 reference books. She pulled them from a section Eli had never noticed, which was a section he now understood he should have been paying more attention to his entire life. American folk art and its traditions, textile history of the Missouri River Valley, documented works of significant American quilt makers, Volume 2. She set them on the table in front of him. "Start here," she said. She opened the first book to a section of photographs. "Look at the patterns. Look at the stitching descriptions. See what matches." "Okay," Eli said. "I'll be at my desk." "You have questions, you come find me. Don't guess. If you don't know, ask." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at Cooper. "You," she said to the dog, "sit." Cooper sat. She nodded and walked back to her desk. Eli opened the first book. 4 hours. That's how long he sat at that table. Cooper slept under his chair for most of it, occasionally shifting position with a sigh that suggested he had opinions about library chairs. Eli read, compared, read again, went back to his photographs and looked at the stitching and looked at the photographs in the books and made notes. The patterns in the bundles he found them, not identical to anything documented, but consistent with a tradition, a specific tradition, Missouri River Valley, the book said, a style that developed in the decades following the Civil War, characterized by specific geometric precision, by the use of particular dye processes, by a density of stitching per inch that was documented in the books with numbers that Eli checked against his own photographs 3 times. His photographs matched. The dye. He read about the dye. Botanical, indigo, plant-derived, labor-intensive, distinctive in both color and longevity. The book said it clearly. Synthetic aniline dyes became commercially dominant after 1897. Before that, serious makers used the real thing. The blue in the bundles was deep, particular, not the flat blue of something manufactured, natural indigo. He wrote pre-1897, Missouri River Valley tradition, natural dye process, stitching density consistent with documented, significant work. He stared at what he'd written. Then he wrote, "This is real." He underlined it. Then he crossed the room to Lenora Quill's desk and put his notebook in front of her without saying anything. She read what he'd written. She looked up. "Yes," she said. "I think it probably is." A pause. "I know someone you should talk to." Dr. Marguerite Sands drove down from Columbia 3 weeks later, 3 weeks that Eli spent doing what he always did when he was waiting for something that mattered too much to rush. He worked. He patched the worst of the roof. He replaced the cardboard window covering with a proper pane he'd sourced from a salvage yard in the next county for $11. He pried up the most dangerous sections of rotted floor planking and replaced them with solid boards he sanded by hand. He did not open more bundles. He decided without quite articulating why that the remaining 26 should wait for someone who knew how to look at them properly. It felt like the right thing, like you wouldn't open someone's letters before the person who could actually read the language had arrived. Nora watched him work and occasionally handed him things and did not tell him he was being careful in a way that was unusual for a 16-year-old boy, because she understood exactly why he was being careful and had the same feeling herself. Barrett Holt drove past on Rudder Road twice during those 3 weeks. Slow, not stopping, just looking. Eli noted it in his notebook both times. Date, time, direction of travel. He didn't mention it to Nora. Dr. Sands arrived on a Thursday morning in a practical sedan loaded with 2 canvas bags of reference materials and a magnifying loupe on a cord around her neck that she wore the way other people wear a necklace, which is to say habitually and without thinking about it. She was 61, brisk in the way of someone who doesn't have patience for the part of conversations that isn't the actual point, warm in the way of someone who has spent 30 years caring deeply about things most people have forgotten to care about. She walked into the shed and stopped. She looked at the workbench where Eli had laid out the first bundle, unwrapped and spread flat the indigo medallion quilt under the cold gray light from the new window. She was quiet for a long time, not the polite quiet of someone waiting to say something diplomatic, the real quiet of someone whose brain has just shifted gears. "Where did you get these?" she said. Not a question, a recalibration. Eli told her everything: the eviction, the dollar deed, the trap door, the bundles. He told it straight through without editorializing, the way he'd learned to say hard things, just the facts. In order, no decoration, let the facts do the work. Dr. Sands listened without interrupting. Her magnifying loupe was already moving over the surface of the quilt before he finished talking. When he stopped, she looked up. "May I see the others?" She worked for 2 hours, opening bundles, examining each one loop, bare hands holding sections up to the light from the window, turning edges, checking backing seams. She photographed everything with a proper camera she'd brought in one of the canvas bags. She wrote in a small leather journal in handwriting, so small and fast that Eli couldn't read it from across the workbench. She did not perform her expertise. That was the thing Eli noticed most. She wasn't explaining herself or narrating her process or doing any of the things adults sometimes did when they wanted to demonstrate their authority to a teenager. She was just working, and he was just watching. And Cooper had stationed himself at the corner of the workbench and was watching too, with the patient, invested attention of an animal that understood he had contributed something to this and was entitled to observe the results. When she was done, she sat in the folding chair Eli had set up beside the workbench. She took the loop off her neck. She looked at Eli directly. "I cannot give you a formal appraisal today," she said. "That requires documentation and a certified process I can refer you to. but I can tell you what I believe I am looking at." Eli waited. "I believe the majority of these quilts are consistent with Missouri River Valley tradition dating to the 1870s through the early 1890s. The indigo in the central medallion piece is botanical, pre-commercial. You do not find that in authenticated work from after 1897 in this region." She paused. "The stitching consistency across multiple pieces is remarkable. The preservation is extraordinary, and the quality of the work itself is, in my professional opinion, not merely good." She paused again, deliberate, like someone setting something breakable down carefully. "Exceptional." Eli wrote that word in his notebook. Then he asked the question he'd been holding for 3 weeks. "Whose are they?" That was the question that changed everything. Not the appraisal figures, which Dr. Sands gave him carefully, and which made his notebook hand go very still for a moment. Not the authentication process, which she outlined and which he wrote down in full. Whose are they? Dr. Sands said she didn't know, but she said it in the way of someone who thought the answer was findable. She told him to start with the county land records, property history for the Rudder Road parcel going back as far as the archives reached. Eli called Lenora Quill from the car on the way back to the shed. "I need to trace a property," he said. "Rudder Road." "Yes." "I figured," she said. "Come in tomorrow. I'll pull what I can tonight." It took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of Eli sitting at the library table after school. 2 weeks of Lenora pulling files and making calls to the County Historical Archive and tracking down church records that had been digitized by a local preservation project in 2009 and sitting with Eli while he read through them. Dr. Sands worked the academic angle from Columbia, cross-referencing property records with historical documentation, connecting the land history with what the fabric and stitching could tell her about time period and regional tradition. They worked parallel tracks and compared notes, and then, one afternoon, sitting at the library table with Cooper under his chair and a folder of county land records in front of him, Eli found the name. Josephine Adler, property transfer, Hardin County, 1871, single female owner, quarter-acre Rudder Road, Clover Falls Township. He read it twice, went back to the church records, there a line in the 1882 ledger of the First Baptist Congregation of Clover Falls, donation to the annual fundraising auction, 4 quilted coverlets contributed by J. Adler seamstress. Another record, 1889, county assessment records, Josephine Adler, smallholding Rudder Road, occupation agricultural labor textile work, and then 1897, estate records, Josephine Adler deceased, no surviving heirs, property to revert to county upon settlement of outstanding obligations. That was the last entry. After 1897, Josephine Adler ceased to exist in the records of Hardin County, Missouri. The property changed hands 4 times over the following decades, then delinquent taxes, then county acquisition, then nothing for a very long time, until a $1 deed signed by a 73-year-old woman standing next to a 16-year-old boy and a golden retriever. Eli sat with the folder open in front of him. He thought about the bundles, 31 of them, wrapped carefully, stored in a dry hatch with wooden-lined walls. The cotton cord knotted in a way that preserved without crushing. She'd stored them like she was coming back. She'd stored them like she had every expectation of returning, and she hadn't returned. And the quilts had waited 126 years. Eli wrote in his notebook, Josephine Adler, born approximately 1845, Clover Falls, Missouri, died 1897, no heirs. He wrote, she made them, all of them, or most of them. He wrote, she put them in the ground and she didn't come back. Then he sat for a long time without writing anything. Cooper put his head on Eli's knee from under the chair. Eli put his hand on the dog's head. Yeah, he said quietly, just that. The article was Lenora's idea. Not a big article, not the kind that gets picked up, just a piece in the county paper, the Hardin County Register, which had a circulation of about 4,000 and was read primarily by people over 50 who still got the print edition on Wednesdays. Lenora knew the editor, had for 30 years. She made a call. The piece ran 2 weeks later. Teenager discovers historic quilt collection beneath $1 shed on Rudder Road. 3 paragraphs. A photograph of 2 of the quilts laid out on the workbench. No mention of Eli's full name, he'd asked, and the editor had agreed, just a 16-year-old resident. Eli read the article on Wednesday morning and thought, good, this is the right size, small enough to be useful, not big enough to cause problems. He was wrong about the second part. Barrett Holt arrived on a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after the article. He didn't drive past this time. He pulled up to the shed and got out of his car with the specific energy of a man who had made a decision and wanted to execute it before he changed his mind. He was not alone. The man with him was wearing a jacket that was too nice for Rudder Road and carrying a folder the way lawyers carry folders, which is with a kind of studied casualness that is meant to suggest the folder is not the point, but is absolutely the point. Eli was working on the south wall, repairing a section of a metal siding that had pulled away from the frame. Cooper was lying in the weak November sun near the door. Cooper raised his head. Eli turned around. Barrett looked at the shed, the new window, the patched roof, the repaired siding with an expression that moved through several things before settling on something calculated. Eli, he said. He said it like he knew the name, like he'd looked it up. Mr. Holt, Eli said. Barrett introduced the man with the folder as an associate who had some expertise in property matters. The associate nodded in the manner of someone whose job is to stand next to a principal and project confidence. Barrett explained. He explained it clearly and with the reasonable tone of someone who has practiced the speech. The deed transfer from the county covered the structure and the land. Standard transfer. What it did not explicitly cover, and this he said was the important part, was the contents of the structure, and, specifically, more specifically, items discovered not within the structure, but beneath the structure, below grade, which raised, he said, an interesting jurisdictional question about whether those items should properly be considered part of the transfer at all. He paused. He looked at Eli. Eli was 16 years old, standing in front of a shed on a gravel lot in rural Missouri with motor oil on his hands from the siding work and a dog sitting calmly beside him. Barrett seemed looking at him to make a calculation. The calculation appeared to conclude manageable. He said the word partnership. He said it like he was offering something. Eli listened to the entire speech without moving, without shifting his weight, without any of the tells that 16-year-olds usually have when they're out of their depth. Because he wasn't out of his depth. He was filing every word, the specific framing, the jurisdictional claim, the word beneath, the folder. When Barrett finished, Eli said, I'd need that in writing, with the specific legal statute you're referencing. Silence. Barrett looked at him. The associate with the folder looked at him. Cooper looked at Barrett with the calm, unhurried attention of an animal that has no particular emotional stake in the outcome but is paying close attention nonetheless. I'll have my lawyer contact you, Barrett said. His voice had shifted, just slightly. The reasonableness was still there on the surface, but underneath it, something had recalculated. That's fine, Eli said. He turned back to the wall, picked up his tools, went back to work. He heard Barrett say something to the associate in a low voice. He heard the car doors, the engine, gravel under tires. He waited until the sound faded completely. Then he set the tools down, picked up his notebook, wrote Barrett Holt, Friday, 2:14 p.m., associate with folder, claim re-subgrade contents not covered by deed transfer, requested statute citation, no citation provided. Next move legal. He looked at what he'd written. Then he called Gus Pemberton. It rang 4 times. This is Gus. Mr. Pemberton, it's Eli Voss. We met at the county office about 2 months ago. A pause. The boy with the dog. Rudder Road. Yes, sir. Another pause. Longer this time. The kind of pause that means someone is thinking about what they know and deciding how much of it to share. Something happened, Gus said. Not a question. Barrett Holt came by today with someone who had a folder. He's making a claim that the items I found below the shed floor aren't covered by the deed transfer. Silence on the line. Eli waited. Huh, Gus said. He mentioned the items being subgrade, below the structure. Subgrade. Gus said the word slowly, like he was turning it over. Huh. Another pause, longer, and then I kept a copy of something from the day we processed your deed. Wasn't sure why at the time. Old habit. Maybe you should come by the office Monday morning. Eli's pen was already in his hand. What time? 8 o'clock. Bring the dog if you want. He's polite. Eli didn't sleep much that night. Not from fear exactly. Not from the sick, helpless feeling he'd had reading the eviction notice back on Decatur Lane. This was different. This was the feeling of a problem that had a shape, a problem with edges you could find if you looked carefully enough. He lay on his sleeping bag in the shed. It was his floor now. His boards, he'd sanded them himself and stared at the ceiling and thought. The bundles were on shelves he'd built along the east wall, rewrapped each one, careful as they'd been when he found them. The ones he'd opened were rewrapped with the same muslin, the same cord as close to how they'd been stored as he could manage. Cooper was stretched out beside him, breathing slow, paws twitching occasionally in whatever dogs dreamed about. Josephine Adler, Eli thought. Born around 1845. That meant she'd lived through the Civil War. She'd come to Missouri in 1871, 6 years after the war ended. She'd farmed, she'd worked. She'd made quilts of a quality that 30 years later could stop a textile historian mid-sentence, and she'd put them in the ground. Why? He thought about that, turned it over. If you made something extraordinary, if you made something you knew was extraordinary, and the world around you had demonstrated consistently and without ambiguity that it was not particularly interested in what you made or who you were, what do you do with that? You protect it, you wrap it carefully, you store it somewhere dry, you put it below the ground where no one who doesn't already know can find it, and you plan to come back, and something happens, and you don't. Eli put his hand on Cooper's back, felt the slow rise and fall. He thought about the eviction notice on the door at Decatur Lane. 3 strips of packing tape. Didn't knock, didn't ring the bell, just left the notice and drove away, like the people inside weren't worth a conversation, like they didn't have to be treated as if they were real. I know what that is, he thought. Josephine knew what that was too. He opened his notebook in the dark and wrote by the light of his phone. She put them underground because above ground wasn't safe for them. She protected the work because no one else was going to. He paused, then he wrote, I understand that. He underlined it. Then he put the notebook down and closed his eyes, and outside on Rudder Road, the November wind moved through the dead grass, and inside the shed, 31 bundles sat wrapped and patient on their shelves, waiting the way they had always waited, like they knew there was no hurry now, like they'd already waited long enough that a few more days meant nothing. Part 3. What lasts? Monday morning, 8 o'clock exactly. Eli and Cooper walked into the county assessor's office the way they'd walked in 2 months before. Same front desk, same water cooler sighing in the corner, same rack of property tax pamphlets that nobody ever touched. Except this time Gus Pemberton was already standing at the counter, waiting. He had a folder in his hand, not a thin folder, the kind that has been sitting in a drawer for a while, getting slightly thicker every time someone adds something to it, just in case. He looked at Eli. He looked at Cooper. Come around, he said. Gus's desk was the organized kind, not neat for appearance, neat because the person using it needed to find things fast. Stacks with purpose, labels on the edges of folders, a system that had developed over 22 years and was now so natural he probably didn't think about it anymore. He set the folder on the desk and opened it. "When we processed your deed," he said, "I pulled the full parcel history. Habit. I've done it long enough that I do it automatically now, even when the transaction is simple." He paused. This one didn't feel simple. Eli didn't say anything. Gus turned to a page near the back of the folder, a photocopy, slightly faded. The original had been typed on a typewriter, which told you something about how old it was. County letterhead at the top, a date March 14th, 1978. When the county first acquired the Rudder Road parcel for delinquent taxes, Gus said standard procedure was to document the condition of everything on the property at time of acquisition, structure, land contents. He pointed to a paragraph near the middle of the page. "Read that section." Eli leaned forward. The paragraph said, "All contents present within structure and subsurface of structure at time of county acquisition are considered appurtenant to the parcel and shall transfer in full with any subsequent deed conveyance. No separate documentation of individual items required. Subsurface, subsurface." Eli read it twice, looked up, read it a third time. "All contents, subsurface, transfer in full." Appurtenant means attached to, Gus said. Goes with the land, not separate. Eli straightened it up slowly. He thought about the man with the folder, the jurisdictional question, the word beneath delivered in the reasonable tone of someone who had practiced the speech. "He didn't know about this," Eli said. "Probably not," Gus said. "Most people don't go back to 1978 on a dollar transfer." "But you did." Gus looked at him for a moment, something in his expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. "I knew your father," he said. "Did I mention that?" Eli went very still. "David Voss worked a crew I contracted with back in the 90s, before the accident." Gus looked down at the folder. "He was a good man, the kind that writes things down and checks them twice." He paused. "I figured if his kid came in here with a problem, it was probably worth checking twice." The water cooler sighed in the corner. Cooper sat very straight beside Eli's chair. "Thank you," Eli said. He meant it in more directions than one sentence could hold. He called Dr. Sands from the parking lot, told her about the 1978 document, read the relevant paragraph out loud, twice. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to give you a name. Paul Mercer. He practices property law in Jefferson City. He's done work with the Historical Society. Tell him I sent you." "Okay." Eli. "Yes. Barrett Holt has no claim. I want you to understand that before you talk to Paul. The document Gus found closes this completely. You're not going into a fight. You're going in to end one." He wrote Paul Mercer's number in his notebook. Then he drove back to Rudder Road. Paul Mercer called back within a day. Eli had emailed the photograph of the 1978 document. Paul Mercer read it, researched the relevant county code, and called back with the particular brisk confidence of a lawyer who has found a clean answer to a clear question. "The appurtenance clause is standard language from that period," Paul said. "It's explicit and it's binding. Everything in that shed and everything below it transferred with the deed. Full stop." A pause. "When Barrett Holt's lawyer contacts you, forward the email to me. I'll handle the response. What do I do until then?" "Nothing. You don't owe him a conversation." Eli thanked him. He put the phone down. He sat in the shed in the pale winter light from the new window and thought about how strange it was that a typed paragraph from 1978 written by a county clerk who had no idea what was under the floor of a shed on Rudder Road had just ended a fight that hadn't even fully started yet. Paper doesn't lie. His father had said that. He wrote it in the notebook one more time just to have it there. Barrett Holt's lawyer sent a letter on a Thursday. Eli forwarded it to Paul Mercer on Thursday afternoon. Paul Mercer replied on Friday morning. Barrett Holt's lawyer did not write again. Barrett came himself one last time. No lawyer, no folder, no associate in a nice jacket projecting quiet confidence. Just Barrett alone in his car on a Tuesday afternoon in late December. Eli was splitting wood. He'd bought a cord of oak from a man 2 roads over and was working through it systematically, the way he worked through most things, one at a time, no hurry, the axe coming down clean when he got the angle right, which was most of the time now. Cooper was lying on the cold ground nearby, watching with the patient advisory air of a dog who has opinions about technique but has decided to keep them to himself. Barrett pulled up and got out of the car. He stood on the far side of the cleared ground and looked at Eli, then at the shed, the new window, the repaired roof, the cord of wood stacked neatly along the north wall under a tarpaulin, the small cleared area in front of the door where Eli had graded the ground level and put down gravel. Then he looked at Eli again. Eli set the axe down, not because he needed his hands free, just because the moment seemed to call for it. He waited. Barrett was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that has something working behind it. "I read the response from your lawyer," he finally said. "Okay," Eli said. "The 1978 document." "Yes." Silence. Barrett looked at the ground, then at the shed, then at Cooper, who had raised his head and was regarding Barrett with calm, unhurried attention. "My father," Barrett said, and then started again. "My father would have handled this differently." "Yes," Eli said, "he would have. It wasn't a wound. He didn't say it like a wound. He said it straight, like a fact that was true and that Barrett probably already knew, and that didn't need decoration." Barrett nodded once, the kind of nod that means a person has confirmed something for themselves. He got back in his car. He drove away, and that was the end of Barrett Holt. January. Roy Adkins drove out from Kansas City on a Wednesday that was cold enough that his breath made clouds when he stepped out of the car. He was 55, heavy-framed, the kind of careful that comes from 30 years of handling things that couldn't be replaced if something went wrong. He brought 2 assistants and more photographic equipment than Eli had expected, and spent an entire day working through all 31 bundles with a thoroughness that was almost meditative. He didn't say much. He made sounds, the small involuntary kind, a low note of appreciation when he opened the cathedral windows piece, a sharper intake of breath at the log cabin quilt's geometry, a long exhale over the flying geese pattern, the triangles so consistent they seem to generate their own kind of quiet authority. Sounds you make when you're trying to stay professional, but the thing in front of you is making it difficult. When he was done, he sat at the workbench and organized his notes. Cooper sat beside him. Roy looked at the dog. "He's been here the whole time," Roy said. "He found the trapdoor," Eli said. Roy looked at Cooper for another moment, then back at his notes. 24 of the 31 are fully authenticable as mid to late 19th century American folk textiles. He paused. 13 of those show sufficient technical consistency to establish single primary authorship. Same hand, working over a period of years. Another pause. 5 pieces are in my professional assessment, museum grade, meaning institutions would actively acquire them. He gave Eli the appraisal figures. Individual pieces authenticated with provenance, documentation 4,000 to 12,000 each. The museum grade pieces significantly more. The collection as a whole with full documentation and provenance established. He gave the total. Eli wrote it down. $196,000. He wrote it carefully. The way you write something when you want to make sure you get it right. When you want the paper to hold it steady because your hands aren't entirely reliable at the moment. He put the pen down, sat still. Nora was standing near the door. She had come in quietly halfway through Roy's summary and stood there without interrupting. Now she was looking at Eli with an expression that was doing several things at once and managing all of them. "Eli," she said softly. "I know," he said. He looked at the number he'd written. Then he looked at the shelves along the east wall where 31 bundles sat wrapped and waiting in the January light. "What are you thinking?" Nora said. He thought about a woman in a house that used to stand somewhere on this quarter acre, working in lamplight, making something extraordinary in a world that had demonstrated repeatedly that it was not particularly interested in what she made, protecting it the only way she could. "I'm thinking about what she would have wanted," he said. He didn't sell right away. That surprised people. Roy Adkins gently had suggested that the market for significant American folk textiles was active and that waiting carried its own risks. Dr. Sand said nothing either way. Lenora Quill, when Eli told her he was thinking, looked at him over her reading glasses and said, "Good, more people should." Eli spent 2 weeks with his notebook. Not paralyzed, thinking. There's a difference. He made lists, not of prices, of questions. What did he actually want to happen to each piece? Who was the right person for each one? What did Josephine Adler deserve from the person who had found what she'd left behind? Because that was the real question, not the money which would be real and significant and would change their lives, but the question underneath the money, the question of what you do when you've been handed something that was never meant to be yours and you have to decide what being trustworthy looks like. He filled 4 pages in the notebook. Then he had his answer. He started with the letter, handwritten, 3 pages, to the Missouri State Historical Society in Jefferson City. He explained who he was. He explained how he'd found the quilts. He explained Josephine Adler, everything he and Dr. Sands and Lenora had found, the 1871 land record, the 1882 church ledger, the 1897 estate filing, the absence of heirs, the 126 years underground, and then he said what he wanted. These quilts were made by Josephine Adler. She was the maker. She deserves to be remembered as the person who made them, not as the person whose things someone else happened to find. I would like any pieces donated or acquired by your institution to be documented, labeled, and exhibited under her name. Not mine, not my grandmother's, hers. He wrote that paragraph 4 times before he was satisfied with it. Then he sealed the envelope and drove it to the post office himself and watched it go. The selling took 7 months, not all at once, not in a rush, one at a time, mostly each piece going to someone Eli had spoken with directly, or that Roy Adkins had vetted, or that Dr. Sands had personally confirmed understood what they were acquiring. The first sale was in March. A woman named Eleanor Bassett from Nashville, 70 years old, 35 years of acquiring American folk textiles. She drove to Rudder Road herself, which Roy had not expected, but Eli had. She examined the medallion quilt in the morning light from the new window, asked 3 questions, precise and technical, that demonstrated she knew exactly what she was holding. Then she wrote the check at the workbench and shook Eli's hand. "I've been doing this for 35 years, she said. "This is one of the finest pieces I've acquired." She shook his hand again, like she was making sure he understood she meant it. Eli deposited the check that afternoon, sat in the car in the bank parking lot for a while, just sat, didn't move, let it be real, then drove back to Rudder Road and got back to work. By September 17, quilts had found homes. 2 to a folk art museum in St. Louis that sent Eli a photograph of one of them hanging under proper exhibition lighting with an explanatory card beside it that told the story, the shed, the trapdoor, the dollar deed, in 3 careful paragraphs. 3 to private collectors who'd come through Roy's network and who had each of them treated the transaction with a seriousness that Eli had not taken for granted and had noted in his notebook. A group of 5 went to the Missouri State Historical Society after a process of negotiation that Dr. Sands helped him navigate, and that resulted in a figure above the individual appraised values, because the society understood as their acquisitions director said in a call with Eli that they were buying not just objects, but a documented piece of cultural history. "We don't often get the chance to correct an oversight this old," she said. "We take that seriously." And the remaining 7 found buyers through an estate auction house in St. Louis that Roy recommended. 3 states represented in the final bidding. A brief piece in an arts publication that described the collection as a significant rediscovery. Eli kept 14, the 5 museum-grade pieces, not negotiable, not at any price, because some things are worth more than what someone will pay for them, and 9 others, because he wasn't done deciding, because patience and hesitation are not the same thing, and he was old enough now to know the difference. The number Roy had given him, $196,000. The actual total from the sales was $184,000, below the ceiling, exactly where Eli had expected, because he'd sold for the right buyer and not the highest offer, which are sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. He put the money in the credit union account he'd opened in October, with Nora's help. He looked at the balance. Then he made 3 lists in his notebook: what they needed, what they wanted, what they could do for other people. He gave each list the same amount of space. He built the house himself. Not entirely. He wasn't delusional about what he knew and what he didn't, but more than he'd expected, more than anyone expected. He started in February and worked through spring into summer, learning as he went the way he'd always learned, methodically from primary sources, writing things down. Plumbing 3 books from the library, 2 online technical manuals, and 1 afternoon with a retired plumber named Owen Marsh, who'd been in the church Nora attended, and who spent 4 hours showing Eli the difference between knowing how something works and knowing how to do it. Electrical, the manufacturer's installation manuals. Careful, slower than everything else. He wasn't careless about things that could hurt Nora. The concrete floor he poured himself on a Saturday in April with a mixer he rented from the hardware store and a technique he'd watched explained in a video 17 times until he understood not just the steps, but the reasons for the steps, which was the only way he learned anything. His hands changed over those months. He noticed it in the mirror once, looking at them without thinking about them and being surprised, calloused in specific places, scarred at the knuckle on his right index finger where a tool had slipped in March, capable in a way they hadn't been before, the hands of someone who had built a thing. Roy Atkins came back in June, not to appraise anything, just came, said he was in the area, which was technically true, and also clearly not the whole reason. He stood in the doorway of the shed and looked at the concrete floor, the new walls, the kitchen corner with the small stove, and the sink Eli had plumbed himself. He looked at Eli for a moment. "You know," he said, "most people your age wouldn't do this." Eli didn't stop the sanding he was working on. "Most people my age have more options." Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he calmly took off his jacket, hung it on the nail beside the door that Eli had put there for exactly that purpose, and picked up the second piece of sandpaper from the floor. He worked alongside Eli for 4 hours without being asked and without making a thing of it. When he left, he shook Eli's hand in the doorway. "Your father," he started, then stopped, started again. "You turned out well." He didn't wait for a response, just walked to his car. Eli stood in the doorway and watched him go. Then he went back inside and finished the sanding. The letter from the Missouri State Historical Society arrived in August. Thick envelope, the good kind. Inside, a formal letter confirming the acquisition of 3 quilts for the permanent collection, a proposed exhibition schedule, a draft of the exhibition label. He read the label 3 times. Josephine Adler, circa 1845 to 1897, Clover Falls, Missouri. 3 quilted coverlets, Missouri River Valley, tradition circa 1875 to 1890, natural indigo and botanical dye, hand-stitched cotton gift of Eli Voss and Nora Ashby, Hardin County, Missouri. Her name, first, largest, not discovered by, not collection of. Josephine Adler, maker. Eli read it one more time. Then he folded the letter and put it in the notebook. He closed the notebook. He sat very still in the shed that was becoming a home in the August light from the 2 windows, and he thought about a woman sitting somewhere on this quarter acre 130 years ago. Lamplight, the particular silence of rural Missouri at night, needle through cloth, making something extraordinary in a world that wasn't looking. He thought she knew what she was making. She always knew. He thought she just didn't know who would find it. The opening was on a Thursday in September. The drive to Jefferson City was 2 hours. Nora sat in the passenger seat. Cooper sat in the back and watched the flat Missouri landscape go by with the interested patience of a dog who finds everything worth looking at. The Missouri State Historical Society was a serious building on a serious street, stone facade, wide steps, the kind of building that says we keep things here, we take that seriously. Eli parked. He looked at the entrance. He looked at Cooper in the rearview mirror. You ready? Cooper's tail moved once, definitively. He can't come in, Nora said. I called ahead, Eli said. She looked at him. Last week, I explained the situation. Helen Marsh, the acquisitions director, said yes. Nora looked at Cooper. You called ahead. He found the trap door. She pressed her lips together. The expression that was not quite a smile and not quite not a smile. Well, she said. Helen Marsh met them at the entrance. She was 58, direct in the way of someone who runs a serious institution and doesn't have time for the preliminary parts of conversations. She looked at Eli, then at Cooper, then at Eli again. The dog that found the quilts, she said. Yes, ma'am. She looked at Cooper for a long moment. Cooper sat very straight. All right, she said, and held the door open. The gallery was quiet. Thursday afternoon, midweek, the light outside coming through high windows and falling across the polished floor in long, pale rectangles. The 3 quilts were on the far wall, proper museum lighting, the kind that finds the depth of color in old textiles and brings it forward without washing it out. The medallion quilt in the center, the log cabin piece to the left, the double ring to the right, and beneath them, the label. Josephine Adler, circa 1845 to 1897. Eli walked toward them slowly. Cooper walked beside him, paws quiet on the floor. No pulling, no rushing. They stopped in front of the medallion quilt. The indigo was extraordinary in this light, deep and particular and alive, in the way that natural things are alive, in a way manufactured things aren't. The stitching caught the light differently from different angles, the geometry of it shifting, breathing, almost the way the very best made things seem to have something still working inside them. Eli stood there for a long time. He thought, she made this. He thought, in the lamplight, with her hands, on this ground. He thought, and here it is, still here, and here she is, still here. Cooper sat down beside him, put his nose up toward the quilt label, considered it for a moment with the quiet attention he gave to things that mattered, then settled and was still, like he was satisfied, like the thing he'd started in the shed that morning in November, the slow investigation at the floorboards. The patient waiting at the trapdoor had now completed its full arc and arrived exactly where it was always going. Nora stood on Eli's other side. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then quietly, she would have liked knowing. Yeah, Eli said. That someone came back. He looked at the label, Josephine Adler. Yeah, he said again. I think she would. October. The home was finished, not the shed, the home. Still recognizably what it had always been on the outside, The metal bones, the corrugated roof, the basic geometry of a working structure on a quarter-acre of Missouri ground. But inside, insulated walls, concrete floor, covered with the wood boards he'd laid, and finished himself, 2 windows filling the space with actual light, a small kitchen in the east corner with a stove and a sink and a shelf for the blue enamel coffee pot that had survived every move. And in the center of the main room, the kitchen table, dark wood, one corner repaired with a patch that had never quite matched, hauled from Decatur Lane in the truck he'd borrowed from Jim Radnor. The only piece Nora had been absolutely not negotiating on. It looked right in this space, like it had always been heading here. Eli stood in the doorway of the finished home on an October evening and looked at it. The trapdoor was in the floor, fitted with proper hinges and a new iron ring. Below it, the hatch cleaned, lined with proper shelving. 14 quilts, rewrapped, stored the way Josephine had stored them. Not underground forever, just kept carefully, kept by someone who understood what they were. The 5 museum-grade pieces he would never sell, the 9 he was still deciding about, all of them wrapped, waiting, patient the way they had always been patient. Nora was at the table with her coffee. Cooper was under the table. The evening light came through the west window at the low October angle that made everything look like a photograph from the best possible day. Eli sat down across from her. She looked at him over her cup. "Well," she said, for the 3rd time, and this time the word meant something completely different than it had the first 2 times. The first time it had meant, "I don't know what to do with this news." The second time it had meant, "I suppose we have no choice." This time it meant, "Look at this. Look at what we made." Eli looked around the room. The light, the table, the window he'd cut himself, the floor he'd sanded, the shelves he'd built. His hands had touched every surface in this room. His hands in the specific education of a year that had started with an eviction notice taped to a door with 3 strips of packing tape and ended here, in this room, with this light. "Yeah," he said. He went outside after dinner. The October night was cold, clear, the Missouri sky at full capacity, thick with stars the way it gets in rural counties, with no light pollution to argue with it. Cooper followed him out and they sat together on the step in front of the door. Cooper pressed close against his side, warm and solid and present the way dogs are present, which is different from how people are present, more complete somehow. Eli had his notebook. He opened it to the page where he'd written months ago in the county library on a Wednesday afternoon, Josephine Adler, born approximately 1845, Clover Falls, Missouri, died 1897, no heirs. He read it. Then he turned to a new page. He thought about everything that had happened in the last 12 months, the eviction notice, the 7 crossed-out addresses, Gus Pemberton, and the sticky note with an address on it. Cooper standing at the shed door with his nose to the gap at the bottom reading something no one else could read. The trap door, the bundles, the smell of old paper rising from the dark. Josephine Adler's name on a wall in Jefferson City under proper light where people would read it for as long as the building stood. He thought about Barrett Holt driving away for the last time, about Roy Adkins taking off his jacket and picking up the sandpaper without being asked, about Lenora Quill pulling 3 reference books from a shelf and saying, "Start here," in the voice of someone who believes that information is the thing that separates people who can act from people who can't. He thought about Gus Pemberton at his desk, reaching into a drawer for a folder he'd kept for no reason he could name at the time because David Voss's son had come in with a problem, and that was worth checking twice. He put his pen to the page. Josephine Adler built something that lasted 130 years. She built it alone, at night, in a world that was not particularly interested in what she was building or who she was. She put it in the ground to protect it. She planned to come back. She didn't, but it lasted anyway. He paused. He looked up at the stars. Then he looked at Cooper, who was watching him with those steady golden eyes, the patient eyes of an animal who has no doubt whatsoever that this is exactly where they're supposed to be. He looked back at the notebook. He wrote, "Cooper found it." A pause. I remembered her name. He read those 2 lines. Then he wrote one more. It's enough to find what was lost. It's enough to say, I know who made this. I know she was here. I know she was real, and her work was extraordinary, and she deserved better than to be forgotten. That's not a small thing. That might be the whole thing. He closed the notebook, sat with it in his lap. The night around him was enormous and quiet and full of Missouri stars that had been there long before Josephine Adler and would be there long after all of them. The cold was settling in the real cold of autumn, turning toward winter, and behind him the shed was warm and lit from inside and full of things that mattered. Cooper pressed closer. Eli put his arm around the dog, and for the first time in a year, for the first time maybe in much longer than a year, he didn't feel invisible. He felt exactly the size of the thing he'd done, which was not a small size, which was, it turned out, exactly enough.